Family vanished in 1994, 10 years later. Police decide to look at the old family camera. In September of 1994, the Bennett family, Robert, Ellen, and their 2 children, packed their bags for a weekend trip to their cabin in rural Idaho. They told neighbors it was just to get away for a few days. The weather was turning, the leaves were changing. It was supposed to be a quiet family retreat before school, and work routines locked back in. They were never seen again. The front door was locked, the truck was gone. But inside the house, the beds were made. Plates were still drying on the kitchen rack. A jacket Ellen always wore was hanging by the door. It was as if they planned to return. Search teams combed the roads between town and the cabin. They found no vehicle, no crash site, no sign of distress. The family had simply vanished as if they'd been erased. Over the next 10 years, the case grew cold, until one afternoon in 2004, during a quiet audit of unprocessed evidence, a young officer opened a mislabeled cardboard box. Inside was a disposable camera from Bennett's home, undeveloped. When they got the photos back, one image taken from inside the house made a veteran detective physically step back because it showed something. It was early morning when Deputy Henning received the call that would change everything. "There's no sign of them, Sheriff, not a damn trace." The voice on the other end of the line was muffled by static, but Henning could make out the distress. The dispatcher had been a young woman, but even she couldn't mask the unease in her voice. He'd been in the office barely an hour, the usual quiet of the early shift keeping the pace slow. The coffee was still fresh, a few half-filled manila folders scattered on his desk. Routine, the usual. Nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary, but today would be different. Henning would soon learn that some things change when you least expect them. And when the town of Thornberry has a secret, it's a secret that stays buried long after the world has moved on. This small mountain town was the kind of place that didn't attract attention, not unless you counted the heavy snowfalls in winter or the occasional search and rescue mission for lost hikers. The trees and the mountains kept Thornberry tucked away from the eyes of the world. But in the spring of 1994, everything was about to change. The Bennett family had disappeared. Robert Bennett was a man of few words, the kind of guy who kept his head down and worked hard. He wasn't much for socializing, and while most folks in Thornberry knew him by sight, not many could claim to have a real conversation with him. He was a mechanic by trade, owning a small repair shop off the main road. His wife Ellen worked at the local school, and their children Jason and Katie were the kind of kids that made you smile when you saw them running around the yard. They were well-liked normal folks, or so it seemed. It all began with a camping trip, a weekend retreat in the hills above town. The kind of getaway that was supposed to bring the family closer a chance to get away from the noise of everyday life and reset. The trip wasn't unusual. In fact, it was exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from a family like the Bennetts, trying to enjoy a peaceful moment before life swept them back into the usual grind. But when they didn't return as scheduled, things took a darker turn. The first sign that something was off came on a Friday night. Ellen had called the school to let them know that the family would be delayed. The usual reason: bad weather, a flat tire, something that would explain the extra day. But when Monday rolled around and there was still no word, the alarm bells went off. The school principal, a woman named Martha, had called the sheriff's department, and Henning was dispatched along with a few volunteers from the local search and rescue team. The last place they had been was a secluded cabin at the edge of the wilderness. About a 2-hour drive from town, up a winding mountain road, and into the thick forests. The Bennetts had rented the cabin for a few days, a remote place where they could spend time without distractions. But now no one knew where they were. Henning was the first to arrive. He parked his patrol car at the edge of the long, dusty trail that led up to the cabin. The road was empty, no sign of a vehicle, no sign of life. He felt an eerie calm settle over him, the kind of stillness that only happens when you realize you're standing at the threshold of something unknown. By noon, the rest of the team had arrived. Henning stood at the trailhead surveying the area. The mountain air was cool, the trees dense and quiet like they were holding their breath. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over him, but it wouldn't leave. "Sheriff, we should check the cabin first," said Reed, the lead of the search and rescue team. Reed was a former military man, tough as nails, with a calm demeanor that Henning always found reassuring. Henning nodded. "Let's go." They made their way up the trail in silence, the forest swallowing their footsteps. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. Henning's mind was focused on one question. What happened to the Bennetts? It took over an hour to reach the cabin. The structure was small, nestled among a cluster of tall trees. It had a rustic charm, the kind of place you'd expect to see on a postcard with a stone fireplace and wooden beams. Henning and the team approached cautiously, looking for any signs of life, but the cabin was eerily quiet. The door creaked as Henning pushed it open. Inside there was no sign of struggle, no broken windows or overturned furniture. Everything appeared as it should, as if the family had simply stepped out for a moment and never came back. But there were clues, subtle ones. The fire was cold, the kind of cold that had settled in hours ago, not days. A half-eaten meal sat on the table untouched. Plates of food, a cup of coffee, all sitting there, like time had stopped in that one moment. Henning's eyes flickered over the room, taking in the details. He stepped into the bedroom, where Ellen's bag was lying on the bed open, as though she'd been in a hurry. But there was no sign of her or the children. Something wasn't right. Henning could feel it. Something was missing, but it wasn't just the family. It was the feeling in the air, that weight of absence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for him to uncover something. And that's when Henning noticed the footprints outside. They were fresh, the impression of boots still visible in the dirt. Someone had been there recently. But where had they gone? Henning didn't believe in coincidences. So when they found the footprints, they were enough to set off a chain of events that would reveal more than anyone had expected. The search stretched for days with no sign of the Bennetts. The family's truck was missing their personal effects left behind. It didn't make sense. As the investigation continued, Henning began to question everyone. Robert, who was so silent, so composed, had he snapped? Was something more sinister at play? The case turned from a search and rescue operation to something much darker, a disappearance no one could explain. And as the days stretched on, the questions multiplied. Where were they? The lead investigator, Henning's superior, ordered a full-scale search of the area. They combed through the forest's overgrown trails and even searched nearby caves. But they found nothing. No signs of the family, no evidence of anything. Then came the discovery that would change everything. 5 days into the search, Henning was looking over the old maps of the area when he got a call. One of the volunteers had found something. A set of tire tracks leading off the main road and into a dense thicket. The tracks were fresh, and they seemed to lead nowhere. They were in the middle of nowhere, too far off the beaten path to be accidental. Henning and the team arrived at the site and found a rental trailer parked beside a narrow dirt path. It was clear that Robert Bennett had returned the trailer after the disappearance, which made no sense. Why would he come back if the family was still missing? Henning couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something that could change everything he thought he knew. But before they could investigate further, Henning got another call. "We found something," came the voice on the other end. Henning felt his pulse quicken. "Not sure what it is yet, Sheriff, but you better come take a look." Deputy Henning felt the chill creep into his bones as he approached the rental trailer. The worn tires, flattened against the dry earth, stood as the only sign of life in the otherwise empty landscape. His boots crunched against the gravel, the silence broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the barren land, and the light felt like it was slipping away from him, leaving behind a creeping darkness that was more than just the hour. Inside the trailer, everything was quiet. It was a small space, cramped and basic. Henning had seen these rental trailers before, but this one felt different. It looked like it had been lived in recently, but there was something off about it. The smell of stale air, mixed with something faintly metallic, lingered inside. The team had already begun their search. They scoured the area around the trailer, looking for any clues that could explain why Robert Bennett had come back to town alone. They hadn't found much, just a few scraps of paper and an old soda can crushed and discarded near the side of the trailer. But Henning was fixated on one thing, the trailer itself. The door creaked as Henning stepped inside, flashlight in hand. The dim light revealed a sparse interior, a small kitchenette, a narrow bed with a wrinkled comforter, a wooden table stacked with papers. He walked toward the table, feeling his pulse quicken. There were maps here, old ones strewn across the surface. The edges were worn and faded, as if someone had used them often. Henning picked one up, his fingers tracing the delicate lines. The map showed the area surrounding Thornberry and the nearby mountain range. He could see the route to the Bennett's cabin clearly marked, but there was something more. Several other locations had been circled in red ink. Henning's gut twisted. Why would Robert mark these? Were these places they'd planned to go, or was something more intentional happening here? He took a deep breath, fighting the creeping sense of unease that clung to him. There was no sign of Robert's family, no personal effects, no photos. But something about the way the maps were arranged almost obsessively made Henning think Robert had been here more than once. The question was, why, Sheriff, we found something, one of the volunteers called from outside. Henning pocketed the map and stepped out of the trailer. He followed the man, his thoughts racing. What was it now? He hoped it was the break they needed, but the nagging feeling in his chest told him it wasn't going to be that simple. They found it about 200 yards from the trailer, tucked behind a cluster of dense pine trees. The volunteer, a young man named Tyler, was standing by a patch of broken earth. His face was pale, eyes wide, as if he had seen something that didn't quite make sense. "What is it?" Henning asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's buried," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We think it's something, old Sheriff. Something big." Henning crouched down, scanning the disturbed soil. It didn't look like much at first glance, but Henning could tell that something had been recently uncovered. He reached down, pushing aside loose dirt with his gloved hands. A piece of metal gleamed beneath the surface. He pulled it free. It was a rusty piece of corrugated steel, too small to be part of a building, but definitely man-made. He wiped the dirt away, examining it more closely. The edges were worn and jagged, evidence that it had been buried for a long time. "It looks like part of a roof," Henning muttered to himself. "Not something that just falls here naturally." Tyler stepped forward. "You think it's connected to the Bennett family?" Henning didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. His mind was already piecing things together, trying to make sense of it. If Robert had been hiding here after the disappearance, why bury something like this? Why go to the trouble of hiding a roof panel and then it hit him? "Get the forensics team," Henning ordered. "Now." By the time the forensics team arrived, the sun was setting. The sky had turned a deep orange, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Henning didn't like it. Everything about this was off. The team began to excavate the site carefully. The metal panel was just the beginning. As they dug deeper, they found more. A wooden beam, a half-collapsed structure, a small room that looked like it had been abandoned for years. When the area was fully cleared, Henning's stomach tightened. The remnants of a cabin lay there, decaying under layers of soil and time. The wood was rotted, the roof long gone. It looked like it had been forgotten, buried by nature's hand. But what struck Henning the most was what they found inside. A child's shoe. Scuffed and worn, but clearly a child's shoe. Henning's heart dropped into his stomach. It looked like something Katie Bennett might have worn. But what was it doing here? Next to it there was a rusted thermos, its cap cracked, and the initials KB scratched into the side. Henning felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. Katie Bennett. Why would her things be buried here? This wasn't supposed to be her family's camp, and certainly not Robert's hideout. Then in the far corner, hidden under a tarp, there was a sleeping bag, still intact, despite the years of exposure. But it was empty. completely empty. Henning's mind raced. Everything about this discovery felt wrong. There were no signs of life here, no evidence that Robert had stayed long, no footprints, no broken branches, but something about the way the objects were arranged, the care taken to hide them, unsettled Henning. He stood there for a long time, staring at the ruins of the cabin and the items scattered around. He didn't know what had happened in these woods. He didn't know what Robert had been doing. But he was beginning to understand that the Bennett family's disappearance wasn't as simple as a missing persons case. It was a story that had been buried for years, and now it was slowly starting to reveal itself piece by piece. Henning just hoped he would be able to figure it out before the trail went cold. Later that night, as Henning sat alone in his office, he sifted through the new evidence, his mind still reeling from the discovery in the woods. The forensics team had cataloged everything: the shoe, the thermos, the sleeping bag. All the objects were being sent back to the lab for testing, but Henning already had a growing suspicion in his gut. Robert Bennett had been here, had buried these things. But why and what did it mean for the fate of Ellen and the children? There were still too many questions, too many gaps. Henning looked down at the photographs of the woods, the cabin, the items they had found. Then he picked up a file, one that had been sitting in the corner of his desk since the start of the investigation. It was the original missing persons report. Henning opened it again, reading through the details. There were inconsistencies, small things that hadn't seemed important at the time, but now felt like pieces of a much bigger puzzle. Robert had returned the rental trailer 2 days after the family was reported missing, and yet he had been alone. No one had seen him with his family. He returned the trailer in person, paid in cash, and left the same day. No one had questioned him. He seemed calm, too calm. But Henning knew something had shifted. Something had happened in the mountains. The Bennetts weren't just lost. They were gone for reasons no one could yet understand. The silence that hung over Thornberry felt oppressive. Henning closed the file with a snap. He wasn't going to sleep tonight. He couldn't. The answers were out there, and he was going to find them. The rain came in sheets the next morning, turning the dirt trails into slick, muddy paths. Henning stood by the squad car eyes, squinting against the downpour. The weather had worsened, but it didn't deter him. If anything, it made the investigation feel more pressing. The world around him had turned into a wet gray blur, and all he could think about was the cabin, what had been buried there, and what Robert had left behind. Inside the office, the storm outside raged against the windows, adding a somber rhythm to the otherwise quiet day. Henning sat at his desk, the file spread out before him like an unfinished puzzle. He leaned forward, brow furrowed, as he reviewed the details once again. Everything felt connected, but the connections were not clear yet. The photos from the cabin haunted him. Robert in the darkness, the abandoned cabin in the woods, the child's shoe, the thermos with the initials KB. It wasn't just that Robert Bennett was missing. Henning felt certain now that he had been hiding something far deeper than anyone had suspected. But what Henning opened a new tab on his computer and pulled up the records from Robert Bennett's background. He had already reviewed the basics, the family's history, Robert's work as a truck driver, and his short stint in the military before being honorably discharged. There were no criminal records, no indications of anything unusual. By all outward appearances, Robert had been a family man, living a simple life with his wife Ellen and 2 kids, Katie and Jason. But the more Henning read, the more he found discrepancies. There was a large gap in Robert's history from the late 80s to the early 90s. He'd moved around a lot during those years, from small towns to larger cities, staying for brief periods in places like Boise and Jackson. There were no permanent addresses, no real reasons given for his comings and goings. Henning leaned back, staring at the screen. Why hadn't anyone noticed? That wasn't to say he thought Robert had always been a man on the run. But something had triggered this change, the behavior that led to the disappearance of his family. The fact that Robert had returned the trailer without his wife or children. Whatever had been building up in Robert's life, it was now spilling over. The hidden cabin was part of that story. and the items left behind those belonged to his family. But why, the deeper Henning dug, the more he realized that the picture of Robert Bennett he had formed in his mind was shifting. The loving father, the dependable husband, he was still there in fragments, but in the cracks between those pieces, Henning saw something else. A man in the midst of a breakdown. A man who might have been hiding more than just his family's disappearance. Perhaps Henning thought he wasn't running away. Perhaps he was running from something or someone. The timeline Henning had been building started to feel like a maze, each turn offering more questions, no answers. The events leading up to the crash, the return of the trailer, and now the discovery of the cabin, all of it seemed tied together by a single thread, but what that thread was, Henning couldn't see yet. The final few days before the family vanished were still unclear. He returned to the last known details, Ellen's notebook found hidden at the cabin, the final incomplete entry scrawled across the yellowed pages. Henning read it again, hoping something new would stand out. He told me not to wake the kids, said we'd leave in the morning. I'm writing this quietly. I don't think we're leaving. It was a haunting line, but it didn't scream panic. It wasn't a letter written in desperation. It was a woman accepting something, but Henning couldn't figure out what. Why did Ellen believe they wouldn't leave? Was she aware of Robert's intentions? Had she sensed something in him that Henning was just beginning to see? The idea that Robert might have planned everything sent a shiver down Henning's spine. He could see it now, the slowly deteriorating relationship between Robert and Ellen. The moments of tension that would have been invisible to anyone else. Could the wreck have been deliberate? If Robert had staged it to make it look like an accident, then he was still out there. But why wouldn't he have just disappeared with them? Henning's phone rang, dragging him out of his thoughts. He picked it up without looking, already half prepared for what was coming. Henning, the voice on the other end, said. It was Reed, the search and rescue guide. Henning had asked him to keep an ear to the ground, to check in on any new developments related to the Bennett case. I think we've got something, Reed continued. Something you might want to see. Henning's pulse quickened. What is it? There's a cabin near the mining trails, Reed said, about 5 miles from where you found that old structure. Not on the maps. It's been abandoned for years, but I've got a gut feeling. Something about it feels off. Henning didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, slamming the drawer shut on the pile of papers. The storm had subsided, leaving a heavy stillness in the air. Whatever Reed had found, it was more than just a hunch. It took Henning and Reed nearly an hour to reach the cabin, navigating the overgrown trails and washed-out roads. The rain had softened the ground, making the drive slow and treacherous. Henning couldn't help but wonder if they were getting closer to the truth or just chasing shadows. The cabin came into view at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by dense underbrush. It looked nothing like the cabin near the first wreck site. This one was smaller, more secluded, and had a weathered, almost secretive air about it. Henning felt a chill spread through him as he approached the doorway. There was no sign of anyone inside. The place was quiet, too quiet. Reed opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Henning stepped inside his flashlight, cutting through the darkness. The walls were covered in layers of grime and mold. The furniture overturned, and old food cans littered the floor. Nothing unusual, Henning muttered, but then something caught his eye, a small object in the corner of the room. He moved closer, kneeling down to examine it. It was a torn piece of a photograph, frayed at the edges. He picked it up carefully, and when he looked closer, he saw the faint outline of a smiling woman, a man standing beside her and 2 children. The image was almost entirely ruined, but Henning could make out the familiar features of Robert and his family. But there was something else, a figure standing behind them, slightly out of focus. Henning's stomach twisted. It was a faint shadow, hard to discern, but it wasn't just a random blur. Someone else had been there. Is it them? Reed asked, his voice low. Henning stared at the photograph. The edges were charred and burnt, as if someone had tried to destroy it. He felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just a place Robert had come to hide. This was a place where something had gone terribly wrong. Henning stood there, the torn photograph trembling in his hand. The image was a chilling reminder of the life Robert had left behind. A family portrait. But this wasn't just a family snapshot. This was something far more telling. The missing shadow in the background, the one that didn't belong, gnawed at Henning's mind. It felt deliberate, and in his gut he knew it was important. He glanced at Reed, who had grown silent, watching him closely. Reed had been in the woods long enough to know when things felt wrong. Who else was here? Reed, Henning asked, his voice quiet but firm. Reed shook his head, his gaze shifting to the dark corners of the cabin. No idea. This place hasn't seen anyone in years. But I've got a gut feeling, Henning. We're not alone in this. Henning tucked the photograph into his coat pocket. Let's check the rest of the cabin. They spent the next hour combing through the place. It was empty, abandoned for a long time. But as Henning examined the back room, a small, sparsely furnished space, something caught his eye. A pile of old newspapers, yellowed with age, sat on the floor. Henning knelt down, rifling through them. Most of it was mundane, but one newspaper clipping stood out. It was an old article, the headline barely legible, "Local Man Disappears After Family Vanishes." Henning's breath caught in his chest. It was dated from 1995, the year the Bennett family went missing. He read through the article carefully, the words striking him like a blow. The article described Robert's disappearance in vague terms, noting how he had returned the rental trailer shortly after the family had been reported missing. The story had been largely ignored by the local media, after all. Robert Bennett had only been an afterthought, a secondary piece of the puzzle. The focus had always been on the wife and children. But now the missing father, the one no one had talked about for so long, was beginning to fit into the picture. But what was truly troubling was the paragraph at the bottom. Almost buried authorities have confirmed that Robert Bennett may have had ties to underground groups involved in illegal activities. However, no substantial evidence has yet been found to support this theory. Henning frowned. He had never seen this lead in the official case files. No mention of underground ties. Nothing about Robert being involved in anything illicit. He looked up at Reed, whose expression mirrored his own confusion. "That's the first I've heard of this," Henning muttered. "Did the department ever mention anything about Robert's connections to underground groups?" Reed shook his head. "No. I've worked these woods long enough to know most of the families out here. Never heard of Robert being involved in anything shady." Henning was starting to piece things together, but the more he dug, the more tangled the web became. What if Robert hadn't simply snapped? What if there was something more to his disappearance, a reason, a dark involvement that no one had ever considered? Back at the station, Henning sat in his office, the photograph still tucked into his coat pocket, the newspaper clipping in front of him. The investigation had taken a turn, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Everything he had believed about the Bennett case was being challenged. He pulled out the other documents, newspaper clippings, interview transcripts, the ledger notes from the rental shop, and laid them across his desk. They formed a sprawling map of contradictions. Robert Bennett's return to town after the family vanished had always been written off as a man in shock. The report had assumed Robert wasn't involved, but Henning wasn't so sure anymore. He thought about the cabin in the woods, the empty space, the items that had been left behind. There had been no sign of a struggle, no hint of violence, but that didn't mean something didn't happen. Henning stared at the clock on the wall. The evidence kept pointing to the same conclusion. Robert Bennett had planned this. His family's deaths, his disappearance. But why? What had Robert been running from? Was it the so-called underground group mentioned in the article? Or was there something far more personal involved? Henning shook his head. This was a question he couldn't answer on his own. He needed to dig deeper to follow this lead, wherever it took him. But for the first time in this investigation, Henning didn't feel like he was chasing shadows. He felt like the shadows were chasing him. Later that evening, Henning took a walk around the small town of Thornberry. It was quiet, too quiet. The streets were slick with rain, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. Henning's footsteps echoed in the stillness, a reminder of how far away he was from the answers he so desperately needed. He walked past the small grocery store and then the diner. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of the ridge where the Bennett family's truck had been found. The place had a cold, desolate feel, now the site of a tragedy buried under years of neglect. Henning stopped by the edge of town, looking out across the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the ridge. The mountains were shrouded in mist, the trees standing like silent sentinels. The woods were alive with the sounds of rain and wind, but there was something else, something deeper, something unsettling in the air. As Henning stood there, a thought came to him, a thought that had been lingering just out of reach. The final entry in Ellen's notebook. The phrase, "we'd leave in the morning." Was it possible that Ellen had known what was going to happen? That she had somehow sensed the darkness that had overtaken Robert Henning, could feel the pull of the unanswered question tugging at him, urging him to follow it wherever it led. But that would take time he didn't have. Because no matter how many leads he chased, no matter how many questions he asked, Henning knew one thing for sure: the answers were buried deep lost, somewhere in the forgotten woods of Thornberry. And if he didn't find them soon, they might just remain buried forever. Henning couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in around him, a tension he hadn't felt since the early days of the case. He had seen countless families torn apart by tragedy, but nothing like this. There were too many questions, too many inconsistencies. The case wasn't closed, not really, not for him. The next morning, Henning returned to the station, his mind still grappling with the new revelations. He pored over the file again. The report from the forensics team, the one detailing the skeletal remains found in the truck, seemed to only raise more questions. There was no sign of Robert, no blood, no bones, nothing that linked him to the crash site. The truck had been intact, and the bodies inside Ellen, Jason, and Katie had been seated as though they were still alive when the vehicle had gone over the edge. It had been a slow, calculated descent, not a random accident. Henning sat back, rubbing his eyes. He glanced at the clock noon, but it felt like midnight. He needed to clear his head. Just as he stood up to grab his coat, his phone rang. "Henning," he answered, his voice still thick with fatigue. "Henning, it's Reed," came the guide's voice, low and urgent. "You need to come back. I found something." Henning felt a shiver run down his spine. He'd expected the case to be tangled, but Reed's words hinted at something deeper, something more dangerous than he had considered. "What is it?" Henning asked, his voice tight. "Not on the ridge," Reed replied. "Something else. Just get out here." Henning didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and was out the door in seconds. Whatever Reed had found, it was important, and whatever piece of the puzzle this was, it was about to change everything. Henning reached the clearing in less than an hour, the air biting as the wind howled through the trees. Reed was already there, waiting by an overgrown path, his expression grave. "I found it," Reed said, his voice steady but low, as if he were afraid to speak too loudly. "Come on." They trekked deeper into the woods, the dense undergrowth scraping at their legs, the silence pressing down on them. They reached a small clearing, an unnatural indentation in the earth barely visible beneath layers of dirt and fallen branches. Henning's heart skipped a beat as he saw the rusted object partially buried in the ground. A metal box worn with time, but unmistakable in shape. "This is it," Reed muttered, kneeling beside the box. Henning crouched, his fingers trembling as they brushed the dirt away. The box opened with a creak, revealing a stack of old photographs, yellowed with age. Henning flipped through them, quickly shots of a family, the Bennetts. But in one photo, a man was missing from the group, standing apart, staring at the camera. Robert Bennett. But it wasn't his eyes Henning looked at. It was the subtle bulge at his waist, something he had missed before. Henning's mind raced, piecing the last puzzle together. The case was never over. It had only just begun.